Hello everyone, Kyle here at FCP Euro. I'm our Mercedes Catalog Manager, and today we'll be discussing Mercedes W211 Suspension as part of our 211 Buyer's Guide series. We'll start with the basics of the suspension system, then we'll take a deeper dive into the common issues on this platform, and we'll even show you how to diagnose some common issues as well. Let's get right into it. In this episode, we're going to be focusing on the W211 suspension system. We're going to go over all of its variants. We'll talk about steel suspension, airmatic suspension, and all of the setups that you can find on each variant. All right, so diving into the suspension on the W211 vehicles, all variants basically have a similar setup regardless of if they're rear-wheel drive or all-wheel drive. You're going to have some sort of double wishbone suspension up front and a multi-link in the rear. Models could come equipped with steel suspension or air suspension. All AMG models or V8 equipped models had air suspension. If I'm losing you with some of these models, be sure to check out our buyer's guide where we go in more detail on all of the variants of the W211. So to get started, I want to go over common issues with the front suspension. On the front suspension, the least resilient component is going to be your lower control arm, your forward tension strut it's called. This one has a hydraulically filled bushing, and 40 to 50,000 miles or so, depending on your environment, you're probably going to blow through this bushing. Telltale sign that it's failed, knocking or creaking noises going over bumps, or if you're doing a visual inspection, you might see what seems to be a very viscous, clear or brown fluid oozing out of the control arm. If you see any of those, it is time to replace your control arm. And there are a couple of different options. A low mileage vehicle, it might be sufficient to just replace the bushing. You might have a lot of life left in the ball joint. On a higher mileage vehicle, anything over about 70 or 80,000 miles, consider replacing the entire control arm, and also we recommend replacing them in pairs. So on our website, we have a control arm kit that includes the left and right control arms, as well as the correct eccentric bolts, in case you need to take the vehicle to the shop and have a minor alignment adjustment. Additionally, if you're looking for the absolute best in control arms that are available for these vehicles, we would recommend considering our Synchro Design Works control arms. These contain a fully articulating monoball bushing, or bearing, I should say, instead of a bushing, and they last 2 to 3 times as long as your traditional hydraulic rubber bushing. They also don't introduce any additional noise or vibration, and these are the arms that I run on my personal vehicle and that we run on our drift vehicle as well. Although the tension struts or the forward control arms are probably the most failure-prone component in your front suspension, there are other components in the suspension that can be troublesome. If you're noticing vibration in your fingertips, especially at highway speeds, it could be an indication that the upper ball joint in the upper control arm is starting to fail. Now, in rear-wheel drive vehicles, that part can be replaced independently of the control arm. So the upper control arm has 2 bushings and a ball joint. The bushings tend to be pretty resilient. You can get up to 150,000 miles out of it. The ball joints, not so much. Now on your 4-wheel drive or 4MATIC models, unfortunately you don't have the option of replacing just the ball joint. You'll have to replace the entire control arm. Another common source of noise on the front suspension are your sway bar end links. Now, from time to time, you might notice a knocking noise from your front suspension. When you're looking at the end links, you might not be able to visually determine that there's an issue. What I've found is if you back the nut off the end link and re-torque it, sometimes that can resolve that noise issue. 4MATIC vehicles have a slightly different arrangement than rear-wheel drive vehicles as it pertains to the lower control arm. So there's a single arm on 4MATIC vehicles that contains a replaceable lower ball joint and replaceable bushings. 4MATIC control arms are extremely expensive, sometimes exceeding $500 per. So if you're noticing an issue with vibration caused by a failing ball joint, or if you have bushings in the control arm that have perished, consider replacing those parts in the control arm as opposed to replacing the entire arm. The rear suspension on these vehicles, not very troublesome. It's a multi-link suspension setup, 5 links per side. One thing that you want to be cognizant of is if you're observing under hard acceleration, the vehicle seems like it's almost steering itself, that could be an indication that you're getting a tow change under acceleration from a bad tow control link. So when you're inspecting the rear of the vehicle, you're definitely going to want to take a look at that. Additionally, if you have a lowered vehicle, you've probably gained a lot of camber in the rear, and that's going to chew through your rear tires. We do have alignment camber kits from SBC that we recommend, or if you're looking for full adjustability, we even have performance camber arms from VRP. Those will help you to dial your camber and tow back into specification and get rid of any unwanted driving characteristics from tow change in the rear. So we mentioned earlier that V8 equipped vehicles, AMG variants, and a couple of other models were equipped with Airmatic air suspension. Airmatic is simply the Mercedes term for a four-corner air suspension with adaptive dampening. If you want to learn a little bit more about the Airmatic systems, we actually have a pretty in-depth article on our DIY blog. But just going into some of the tools that I would recommend you have for troubleshooting and some of the more common problems with the system, we've got a couple of parts and tools laid out on the table here. Starting with the front suspension, this is going to be your front air strut. This is an aftermarket remanufactured unit from Arnott, but essentially even if you have the OE part, it looks the same. It looks identical. If you're troubleshooting and trying to determine if you have a problem with the front air strut, it's normally as simple as noticing one side of the vehicle significantly lower than the other. So if you come out to the car and you notice the left side's very low or the right side's very low, it is very likely that your front air strut is the source of that problem. One step that you can take to maybe verify that it's the source of the problem is simply using the axle lift button to raise the vehicle. What the module typically does is it'll raise the front suspension first and then the rear suspension. And if it begins to raise the front suspension and you can hear a hissing noise or you can see that corner begin to drop immediately, it's a pretty safe bet that the air strut needs to be replaced. If you're going to service any part of the Airmatic system that has an airline attached to it, we definitely recommend having the correct tool available. This is an airline fitting socket from Bascombe. What you notice is it fits over the airline port and provides pretty good engagement. What will happen is if you try to use a regular 10mm wrench, you're not going to be able to use the socket because of the airline. But if you try to use a wrench, you're not going to get full engagement. You're going to tilt the wrench and you might round off the edges of an airline fitting, something you really don't want to do. If you do round the edge off because you don't have the correct tool, these fittings are sold separately on our website. I'm just going to remove one from the valve block to show you what it looks like. So you have the fitting here. There's an O-ring that seals that connection. And the fittings on the valve block as well as on the air strut are similar. So although I mentioned the front air strut being the most likely source of the problem if you have one corner that's lower than the other, there are other possibilities. You could have an issue with a cracked airline. You could have an issue right at the valve block, but to be quite honest with you, it's very uncommon to have those issues. If you suspect that you have a problem with the valve block, you can remove the port, similar to what I showed you earlier, and just look inside the port. It is constructed out of aluminum, and sometimes the ports do oxidize, and that can happen if you haven't changed the filter in your air suspension frequently enough and you've introduced moisture. In those cases, there will be some oxidation, there will be some pitting inside the valve block, and it might not be sealing correctly. But what I've seen is the most common issue when you have those symptoms, it's going to be your front air strut. Now, when you're going to install it, if you're installing an OE strut, like a Bilstein, for example, or a strut from the dealer, they're going to come deflated. The opposite is true when you're dealing with an aftermarket reman unit. The last thing that Arnott does before they ship this product out is they're going to air test it. So it's going to come to you fully pressurized. So the first thing you want to do when you unbox one of these units is squeeze this area right here and confirm that it's still nice and firm and solid. If it's not, it means that this unit is not going to hold pressure, and you definitely want to get in touch with us. It might be harder at times to install this unit because it comes to you fully pressurized. So referring back to the Airmatic article that's on our DIY blog, we show you how to use some very simple tools. We have a connector and your standard 9-volt battery that you can get just about anywhere. and we show you how to activate the solenoid to open the air chamber and deflate the strut before you install it. So be sure to check out that article. So I briefly mentioned the airline fitting tool that you would use if you were installing or removing an airline, but there are a couple of other tools that you're going to want to have in your arsenal if you're looking to troubleshoot your air suspension. Definitely good to have a multimeter. Multimeter is going to help you with basic checks such as, am I getting 12 volts to my suspension compressor? If the compressor is not getting 12 volts, it's not going to turn on, the vehicle's not going to lift. It's good to have this guy. Additionally, if you're trying to determine if the compressor is outputting enough pressure to work the system, it's good to have a pressure gauge. We have one here from CTA that threads into the pressure port on the compressor, and you can use it to verify that you're getting at or about 10 bar. That's going to let you know that your compressor is pretty healthy. And then lastly, if you really need to dive into the suspension module to determine why you have certain faults, it's good to have this guide. This is going to talk directly to the suspension module. If you have a fault related to the vehicle taking too long to rise, or anything for that matter, this is going to allow you to go into the module, look at the fault codes, look at the live data such as the voltage to the system or the system pressure, things of that nature. It will allow you to look at axle level, which could be valuable. So there are a number of things that make this tool very powerful in troubleshooting your air suspension. So in the rear of your vehicle, you're going to have your rear air springs. The air spring has an additional reservoir. You'll have your shock absorber, which is divorced from the air spring. It's not like the strut assembly up front. And you're going to have your level sensors, very similar to the front. Things to be aware of: if you've hit a pretty hard bump and you notice the rear of the suspension is really jacked up, it's not uncommon for the linkage for the level sensor to get damaged and provide the suspension module with incorrect information. So if you're noticing the car is really high in the rear, it's typically the level sensor or the linkage for the level sensor. Rear airbags, probably the most common failure of any suspension component on the vehicle. So if you've got one side or the other low, definitely consider replacing both airbags. R-Not makes a fantastic unit with a slightly different design from the OE version. Functions just like OE, but it is quite a time saver because it doesn't include the reservoir. So if you're going the R-Not route, you are going to have to replace both rear airbags. If you're going the OE route, you can get away with replacing just one. However, I really don't recommend it because of how failure prone those units are. Thanks so much for watching our series on the Mercedes 211 suspension system. We hope you come away from this with more knowledge on how the system works and information that will give you the confidence to troubleshoot, diagnose, or even service your own W211 suspension. If you like what you've seen today, don't forget to like, subscribe, and comment below. Thanks for watching. That's it. Okay, we're done. Suspension's done. Life is good.